For 50 years, the Central Intelligence Agency was the vanguard of America's Cold War against the Soviet Empire. Its heart and soul lay in its ground troops, the men of the DO, the Directorate of Operations. Secrecy was their shield, covert action and espionage, their weapons.
They used to call it the Great Game, but it was an extremely serious game of life and death between two superpowers.
You could get killed. It's a dangerous job. If you don't, you'll come home having said it was the best job you ever had.
I said, tell Abu Abbas that I'm coming after him. And when I get to him, I'm going to kill him.
1997 marks a half-century for the CIA. America's secret warriors are finally emerging from the shadows to tell the stories of their battles against communism. Today, the agency confronts a new world order, fraught with terrorists, global organized crime, and illegal drugs. It must now pass its most crucial test yet, learning from its past, finding a new role for the future.
The two oldest professions in the world are prostitution and espionage. They go back to biblical times. They've always been done in exactly the same way for centuries. Now, does anybody think they're going to be changed in the 21st century just because the American people don't like the idea?
The body of William Colby, director of the CIA in the mid-1970s, washed up today on a riverbank in southeastern Maryland. A police spokesman said that Colby had apparently drowned while canoeing more than a week ago.
When William Colby died in May 1996, some saw his memorial as the last rites for the CIA itself.
William Colby served his nation as a spy who saw himself firstly as a public servant, especially during that sinister political season we called the Cold War.
They were a brotherhood, a bold and secret fraternity, respected, feared, and reviled throughout the world. William Colby was a charter member who personified its highest aspirations and presided over some of its most brutal failures.
He has been called a soldier priest or a soldier monk, but I would say that the combination of those two qualities makes a very good intelligence officer. A combination of having the moral high ground and an ability to be ruthless when you have to be.
For the secret warriors, the world was the battleground. They were the guardians of the agency's mystique and reputation. A small cadre who fought the covert wars of sabotage, propaganda, and subversion. These were the men of the DO, the Directorate of Operations.
The essence and the soul of the CIA is in the Directorate of Operations. You know, that's what's special about CIA.
The DO is the CIA. Without the DO, the CIA looks like Rand Corporation or anything else.
The Directorate of Operations has become really the president's last centurions. They will march for him, whatever party he comes from.
The secret warriors marched for 9 presidents during the Cold War. Today, their legacy is tarnished and faded. But in the beginning, they were among America's best and brightest. It started with Pearl Harbor. The surprise attack that brought America into World War II should have been no surprise at all. The military had compiled enough intelligence to know that the Japanese were coming, but failed to put the pieces together. William Wild Bill Donovan, a World War I hero and Wall Street lawyer, was brought in by President Roosevelt to head the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Donovan's mission was to bring America's intelligence operations under one roof.
He had a tremendous feel for people. He had that knack. He remembered every name. He remembered every scene. So when Roosevelt gave him the go-ahead to set up this office, well, he wrote to the top university people, to the top banking people, to the top business people, to the top scientists, the top engineers. He got them all to come to Washington, like a Pied Piper.
To the tables down at Maurice, to the place where Louis dwells, to the dear old Temple Bar we love so well.
Yale University spawned many officers of the OSS and later the CIA. It was a world of establishment ties and secret societies, small elite fraternities that became the model for the intelligence brotherhood.
The senior societies are very important at Yale. There was about 90 people out of 700 who graduated who were in them. And they were not all the outstanding people, but they tended to be people who had accomplished something. And it was, I guess, that horrible word male bonding. But, I mean, you got to know these people very, very well.
We are poor little lambs who have lost our way. Ba, ba, ba.
Jack Northrop graduated from Yale in 1943. From his class alone, 42 men went into the intelligence service. Among the insiders, the OSS earned the nickname "Oh So Social."
A lot of these Ivy Leaguers, the sons of J.P. Morgan and various others, all collected around OSS because they thought, this is going to be interesting work. Donovan's a leader. We'll get in there and win the war.
Richard Helms, a Williams College graduate, played a key role in organizing Donovan's European spy network, the intelligence gathering arm of the OSS. William Colby came out of Princeton and worked the covert action arm of the OSS.
You were dropped into some resistance area, and then you were supposed to bring in more guns and more explosive and so forth, and report intelligence that you learned, help them organize, train them on some of the new weapons that they'd never seen, that sort of thing.
When World War II ended, the United States hoped its victory would usher in a new era of peace. The armed forces were demobilized, and the OSS was disbanded. But Stalin's Red Army occupied Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Empire was taking aim at capitalism around the world.
Here was another totalitarianism, the same kind of threat that we'd faced from Hitler, same expansionist, totalitarian power that we had to stand up to. Well, obviously, intelligence is part of that.
Old enemies became new friends as the free world faced the communist threat. General Reinhard Gehlen had been Hitler's commander of intelligence against the Soviet military. He was recruited by U.S. intelligence to head a team of ex-Nazis who were paid to be America's eyes and ears behind the Iron Curtain. It was the first in a long history of unholy alliances.
You'd never like to use Nazis, but we needed their information. They had a very good intelligence operation on the Soviet army and on the fort, and they've been working there for a long time. I just felt it was a necessary thing. Don't like to kill people either, but you know, if you're in the Marine Corps and you're on a coral reef, you're attacking a coral reef, you don't worry too much about the fact you're killing Japanese to take the island.
The world is tired of political fanaticism.
National security became the national priority. In July 1947, President Harry Truman signed the act that gave birth to the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA's mandate was to help the President of the United States contain the Soviet menace. When diplomacy or military action was inadvisable or impossible, the President could turn to his secret warriors. Their operations would be hidden not only from America's foes, but also from its elected officials and its citizens. If a covert action was discovered, the President could disavow knowledge of it. This doctrine came to be called plausible deniability.
At Republican headquarters, a tremendous ovation greets the President-elect and the next First Lady. A beaming Ike and a radiant Amy. The long campaign is over. The American
When Dwight Eisenhower took office, he brought with him two brothers to run a foreign policy dedicated to stopping communism in its tracks. John Foster Dulles, a Wall Street power broker, took over as Secretary of State. Allen Dulles, a dapper Princeton OSS man with an appetite for covert action, was his shadow counterpart at CIA.
Allen loved the great game. He'd had tremendous experience as a case officer, as head of OSS in Switzerland during the war, and he had a tremendous enthusiasm great charm. He was sometimes called the Great White Case Officer.
Only months after taking office, the Eisenhower Dulles Covert Action Program began to pay dividends.
Former Premier Mossadegh's ruined house is a mute testimony to 3 days of bloody rioting culminating...
In 1953, when Iran's prime minister threatened to nationalize British-American oil interests, the CIA took action. A few agency officers hired a local mob to protest against the government. Mossadegh was toppled. The pro-American Shah was returned to power. The Brotherhood had orchestrated its first coup.
The Shah, who had fled to Rome, comes home. Iranian oil may again flow westward.
In Guatemala a year later, it was bananas instead of oil. A popularly elected left-wing government threatened to seize property to give to the peasants. The plantations belonged to Guatemala's largest landowner, America's United Fruit Company. The Dulles brothers, who had close ties to the corporate giant, saw a communist menace looming south of the border.
It wasn't anything but business interest. Had nothing to do with communism. It just had the fact that the government had taken over land that belonged to the United Fruit Company, and they can't do that.
Philip Rettinger, a former Marine, was one of the CIA's men assigned to Guatemala. The CIA disguised old American planes to look like Guatemalan rebel aircraft and faked radio reports to create the illusion of a mass revolt.
There were several stations being broadcast, and they staged things like, Colonel, now move your troops over this way, and then Colonel so-and-so, and then try. Of course, they didn't have any colonels, but they would make it sound like there was a regular army invasion. It was a wild. You know, I thought at the time, I said, this cannot work. This won't work, but it did work.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Cuban army pilots...
The Brotherhood, led by Allen Dulles, was on a roll. But the great game ran aground in 1961 at Cuba's Bay of Pigs. The CIA trained and armed a brigade of Cuban exiles to attack the island, in the hope of provoking the people to overthrow Fidel Castro. The ill-conceived operation was a disaster, and worse, the agency failed to conceal its role. There was no plausible deniability for the new president, John F. Kennedy.
As I've said from the beginning, the operation was a failure, and that the responsibility rests with the White House.
Kennedy was livid. Privately, he said that he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. A few months later, he fired Allen Dulles. The man who molded the CIA's mission and mystique was shamed. The Brotherhood was no longer invisible or invincible.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
The clarion call of John Kennedy's presidency inspired a new generation of college students.
We had an incredibly large amount of faith in the institutions of government at the time. And within every campus, just about, in the United States, were a number of educators, professors, that were in fact spotting for CIA, for Peace Corps, for anybody, the Foreign Service. And we had an America Incorporated that had a common goal of some sort.
What I saw my life as is advancing the interests of the American people or government in foreign affairs. And really, it was, you can say, as naive and as simple as that.
I can't get over the feeling that I had when I showed up. This was an outfit that had an image that only the best and brightest from the Ivy League schools with tremendous political connections got in the door. And the truth of the matter is, I was really grateful to be there.
I considered the agency at that time as something like an adult Boy Scouts who were looking then for young, active men to handle their paramilitary operations.
America's young commander-in-chief was also James Bond's most famous fan. Though he had been burned badly by the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was still intrigued by the possibilities of covert action.
Kennedy brought forth the romance of counterinsurgency warfare to fight this new type of warfare, this secret warfare. And we, in essence, were the secret warriors caught up in his movement.
security of all Southeast Asia will be endangered if Laos loses its neutral independence.
As the countries of Southeast Asia began to liberate themselves from colonial rule, the U.S. government worried that they would turn to communism. A crucial test came in the tiny country of Laos. By 1961, communist insurgents were beginning to make headway against the American-backed Laotian government. Kennedy ordered the CIA to keep them at bay. The secret warriors went high into the mountains to recruit and train native Hmong tribesmen. They would be taught to counter the Soviet-backed guerrillas, the Pathet Lao. One of the first men there was Tony Po, a hard-drinking Marine veteran of Iwo Jima and Korea. He had also taken part in a daring rescue of the Dalai Lama from the Communist Chinese. Some claim he was the model for Colonel Kurtz, the character played by Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now.
By the old Mulvine Pagoda, looking eastward to the sea, there's a Burma girl a-sittin', and I know she thinks of me. For the wind is in the palm trees, and the temple will cry, and all that crap.
A lot of people who were on their way to Laos wanted to work with Tony. He had that kind of reputation. I was, I suppose, a little bit in awe of him. He was a little bit larger than life.
George, I'm going to give you
I was the new kid on the block, and he was a big, strong, aggressive individual and demanded an awful lot of the people working for him.
Do you remember when I first came to know you?
Yeah.
You got off the airplane, and you picked me up and threw me back on the airplane? Is that what you did to him? That's what
No,
did
no.
he really do that?
No.
Yes, he did.
George Kenning got out of college, wanted action, and made the grade in the CIA. He heard about Tony Po and became his protege. Colin Thompson was an idealistic Yale man who also signed on for the secret war in Laos.
To me, at that age, it sounded a lot more interesting than walking the streets in Berlin or someplace. So I went up country, got in my little airplane with Air America and flew up and circled around in the mountains of Laos, waiting for the clouds to lift so we could pop down into Longcheng, which at that time was really very primitive. And Tony was living in a tent, really. He used parachutes for his ceiling, and that was very sexy, frankly. We thought that was pretty hot stuff.
To supply the war, the CIA set up its own secret air fleet, Air America. Masquerading as a civilian airline, Air America was manned by a collection of ex-GIs and chopper jockeys. For many of Air America's pilots, Laos was the defining experience of their lives. 30 years later, they still gather every year to relive their exploits.
I don't know what they saw, but the flying saucer went like that. I don't think the F-84s even saw it.
A missionary flying for the Christians in Action, which is the CIA.
Yeah, he said, they're going to kill you. I said, hey, man. Nobody kills Tony Po.
Yeah.
Tony Po remains their hero, a living legend.
Hey, if I told you some of the things that I did, you'd say you're a liar. You couldn't do it. I was involved in the most beautiful killing operations of... No, but I could do it because I'm a little bit unconventional.
So they're always asking Tony, well, how do you know you killed so many people? And Tony would basically say, well, that's my word. You don't trust me? Send me home.
Hey, the guy said, how many did you kill today? The body count on the radio at nighttime. I had a machine gun section. Well, I said, I've got 8 pair of ears on my belt here. I said, how's that? He said, well, I want to see him.
A manila envelope arrives from upcountry addressed to Charlie, to Whitey, as he was known, Whitey, and from Tony. And I just happened to be in his office at the time, and he opens up the office, opens up the envelope, and out spill about 2 dozen ears. Yeah.
1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, back in the bay.
I think even looking back, if I had it all to do over there again, I wouldn't have wanted any other job. In fact, those days I jumped a lot even without a helmet. That's probably what's wrong with me now.
Bill Lair, a native Texan who still lives in Thailand, was the CIA's key strategist in Laos. It was Lair who trained the Hmong to fight the communist guerrillas. He chose Van Pao, a local leader, to head the CIA's proxy army, which eventually grew to number some 30,000.
When they approved to arm the first 300 men, we asked Wang Pao to pick a place that was as far away and difficult to reach as possible to give us time to drop the first 300 weapons and to train the people. And I asked him, how long would it take the communists to get up there? Because once we start dropping, they're going to know. And he said about 3 days. So we said, all right, we'll come up with the 3-day training. The communist forces came right on schedule, and the Hmong routed them very easily.
There were early signs of success in Laos, but in 1965, the U.S. decided to pursue a more conventional military strategy in Southeast Asia. Kennedy's secret warriors were overshadowed by Lyndon Johnson's B-52s and American GIs. Bill Lair saw where things were heading and decided to leave Laos in 1968.
My expertise was in the pure guerrilla warfare and that sort of thing. This was going in a different direction, and somebody else could do it as well as I could. And it was probably better for me to leave because I wouldn't have felt good doing something I didn't believe in.
Many of the CIA officers in Laos were dismayed by the U.S. abandonment of their guerrilla adventure. They left behind 80,000 dead Hmong allies and the scattered remains of an ancient culture.
It was very depressing. Had they continued with the paramilitary type program, it certainly would have been at a far less cost in lives and everything else. In other words, we could have lost a lot cheaper.
Everybody said we lost the goddamn bullshit. Good for you. The goddamn politicians lost it.
The Brotherhood's secret war in Laos was eclipsed by a much more public war. All eyes turned to a neighboring country, Vietnam. William Colby had commanded the CIA's operation in Laos. In 1968, he was reassigned to Saigon, where he set up a covert action to root out communists in the South Vietnamese countryside. It would become one of the most notorious operations in the CIA's history.
I ran the so-called pacification program there, which was, again, a business of helping the people to defend themselves, with local forces to back them up. I was responsible for handing out 500,000 weapons to the people in the villages in Vietnam, not to the soldiers, not to the police, but to the people.
Ralph McGehee, a veteran CIA officer, was assigned to Phoenix and soon had grave doubts about the program.
The Phoenix program was based on the concept that the communist movement in Vietnam consisted of guerrillas who were terrorizing people, forcing them to cooperate, when in essence the majority of the villagers were loyal communists who would dedicate their lives to fighting the Americans. So we were fighting a war in Vietnam that had nothing to do with reality.
Thousands of innocent people were swept up in an operation that grew more and more out of control.
The Phoenix program was a real nightmare. People were being arrested, interrogated, tortured. The Phoenix teams were being sent out to assassinate and capture the leadership of the communist movement.
The Ace of Spades was the calling card for Phoenix teams that killed an estimated 40,000 Vietnamese. For McGehee, Phoenix took a devastating personal toll.
Here was my faith in this wonderful organization I was part of. Here was my faith in my country that I was so proud of. Here was my faith in everything we were doing I was so proud of. It just shattered. At one point, I was sitting in my villa and I was drinking a martini, and I thought, oh my God, I just threw my glass at the wall and it shattered. And I thought about my gun upstairs, that I should consider killing myself.
Ralph McGehee eventually left the agency and has been an outspoken critic ever since. By 1968, the Vietnam War was bitterly dividing America. So too did it tear at the heart and soul of the CIA Brotherhood. Its unquestioned mission was beginning to unravel. In the 1960s and 70s, Latin America was exploding. The CIA's biggest fear, that Fidel Castro would export revolution, was coming true.
We financed operations wherein they placed bombs in churches in different parts of the country and left behind pro-Cuba propaganda. This would then stimulate enormous demonstrations against communism.
Philip Agee was among the promising young CIA officers helping military governments stem the revolutionary tide. He was stationed in Uruguay, where his agents infiltrated communist groups for the local police.
I was in the police chief's office with my boss at the time, John Horton, and suddenly I hear something strange. It's like a wailing coming through the walls. It got louder and louder and screaming, and then moaning and horrible sounds, and it was quite clear that somebody was being tortured, and we were hearing it. I realized what I was working to support, and I didn't want to do that anymore.
In 1969, Agee did the unthinkable. He quit the CIA and decided to write a diary that exposed secret CIA operations. No one inside the Brotherhood had ever broken his oath of secrecy.
It was not enough simply to describe what the CIA does. It was important to neutralize, and I don't mean kill, I mean neutralize the effectiveness of everybody doing it. And that's why I was involved, after my first book came out, in the exposure of hundreds and hundreds of CIA people around the world.
He betrayed everybody he knew. Every person that thought he was a friend or a colleague, he betrayed.
John Horton was station chief in Uruguay, Agee's boss and one of his confidants.
It isn't just a matter of his giving away secrets. He was spoiling the lives and the careers of people that knew him and trusted him. Think of betrayal, and I think you can understand how I feel about Agee.
Agee, branded a defector and traitor by the Brotherhood, went into exile in Europe. His book was part of an avalanche of revelations hurled down on the agency as the press began to focus on 30 years of proxy wars and dirty tricks.
In September of 1974, as the book went to the printer, the revelations came out about the CIA's intervention in Chile to provoke the overthrow of Salvador Allende.
President Richard Nixon had ordered the CIA to destabilize Allende's socialist democracy. The agency orchestrated strikes, food shortages, and finally, the coup that killed the Chilean leader. When the story broke in 1974, Congress, fed up with the lies of Vietnam and Watergate, went after the CIA with a vengeance.
The attitude in the White House seemed to be, if in the wake of Vietnam I can no longer send in the Marines, then I will send in the CIA.
The Senate investigation, headed by Senator Frank Church, began to blow the Brotherhood's secret operations wide open. A shocked nation heard about hundreds of covert operations, including one program Richard Helms helped institute back in the 1950s, secret drug experiments.
Reefer!
You know what day it is today, Cap?
Yeah.
What? What day of the week?
Wait a minute. Don't bug me.
The CIA and the Pentagon had feared that the Soviets were conducting mind control experiments with a new substance called LSD. The U.S. military began its own experiments with the drug, using American soldiers as subjects.
I can't remember. Come on, man. I don't want this stuff.
The CIA tested unwitting Americans in an operation called MK Ultra. It hired a federal narcotics agent, George Hunter White, to run it. White then brought a bureau colleague, Ike Feldman, into the operation.
He says, we have some mind-bending drugs.
And he says, I'd like you to see what they're all about and let me know so I can tell the people in Washington.
The CIA gave White and Feldman immunity to set up brothels to conduct sex and drug experiments. Long before Timothy Leary in the psychedelic 60s, the CIA was running its own acid tests.
I would go to various bars, massage parlors. I said, honey, I want you to do a favor for me. Yeah, I said, I want you to pick up Joe Blow, take him to the apartment, and give him a blowjob. And while he's there, I want you to ask him, hey, you know that airplane? How high did it fly?
Hundreds of the agency's most tightly held secrets were revealed in a series of congressional probes. The so-called family jewels were described in detail by its new director, William Colby.
Have you brought with you some of those devices which would have enabled the CIA to use this poison for killing people?
We have indeed.
Colby stunned the country with the most controversial secret of all, the CIA's numerous attempts to assassinate foreign leaders.
Don't point it at me.
One of the main targets of the agency's exotic arsenal was Fidel Castro.
What they wanted me to do was see if I could recruit somebody to get into Cuba to either kill Castro or dope his drinks or do something to make him look like a damn fool.
Have any reason to think that it might say how, if at all, this material was used in an aggressive way against someone to kill someone?
Well, there may well be some of that.
The hearings showed that under the Kennedy administration, the CIA had hatched 24 schemes to kill Castro, including one to infect him with botulism. Another plot involved hiring mafia hitmen to murder the Cuban president. When it was Kennedy, not Castro, who was killed, some in the agency worried that their Cuban operation may have tragically backfired. CIA officer Sam Halpern, who had worked on the Castro problem, was at lunch with his boss when they got the fateful news from Dallas.
All we had from the head waiter was the president had been shot. At that point, we didn't even know he had been killed. And I called for the staff car to come get us to bring us back to the agency. And while we were waiting for the staff car, the only thing that I said to Des was, I hope it's got nothing to do with Cuba.
In 1978, Richard Helms was grilled about covering up the Castro plots.
Or why didn't you tell the Warren Commission about the efforts to get rid of Fidel Castro or to overthrow the Cuban government?
But, Mr. Dodd, you're singling me out as to why I didn't march up and tell the Warren Commission when these operations against Cuba were known to the Attorney General of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the President of the United States himself, although he at that point was dead. I mean, all kinds of people knew about these operations high up in the government. Now, why am I...
Helms was not about to let the CIA take the fall.
Originally, there was a concept abroad that these covert action matters would be handled in a non-attributable way. In other words, if they blew up, they wouldn't blow back on the president or the White House. But all through this period of time, the President of the United States has been aware of and has been approving all of these covert actions.
After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, President Kennedy had authorized a new CIA effort to destroy Castro and his economy, Operation Mongoose.
John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, were very insistent on having action right away. They wanted what they called boom and bang.
There isn't any doubt as to who was running that effort. It was Bobby Kennedy on behalf of his brother. It wasn't anybody else.
You've heard of the doctrine of plausible deniability.
Yes, and I've rejected it now, Senator. I say that we cannot depend upon that anymore.
The question I was going to put to you is...
The investigations were taking a terrible toll on the agency. Americans were outraged by what they were hearing, and two of the Brotherhood's leaders were set against each other. It was brother against brother. Helms remained defiant, while Colby cooperated.
They were out of the old tradition. We don't talk at all. Just silent, Stonewall. And it was my feeling that that wouldn't work, that Congress had the constitutional authority, and it was a matter of trying to convince them that this was a very valuable agency.
Colby was also pressured to reveal that his former colleague Richard Helms had lied to Congress about the CIA's involvement in Chile. Helms was fined and given a suspended sentence for lying to Congress.
Told me to do. And as long as the matter is in the court, I'm saying nothing.
To the end, Helms held to the Brotherhood's code of silence. He became known as the man who kept the secrets.
Certainly I was secure. I didn't talk about operations. I didn't talk about agents. I didn't talk about things which were legitimate secrets of an intelligence organization. And I kept the faith in these matters. There was no doubt about it. And if that's what they meant by secrets, I did keep the secrets.
Helms and Colby rarely spoke again, and the Brotherhood split ranks behind them. The church hearings were a watershed. Permanent congressional committees were set up to oversee the agency. The president's secret warriors were no longer above the law or beyond the reach of public scrutiny. The glory days were over. It took Ronald Reagan's election to resurrect the CIA. When Reagan named his campaign manager, William Casey, to lead the agency, it ushered in a new era of CIA activism. Like many of the old boys, Casey came out of Wall Street and had been an officer in the OSS. Like his boss, he was an avid Cold Warrior, a welcome lifesaver to a drowning Brotherhood.
Casey liked operations officers. He assumed they were action-oriented.
He loved us. Maybe not wisely, but certainly more than most of his outside predecessors and successors did.
Together, Reagan and Casey revived America's war against communism. They launched their first attack in Central America.
If we do nothing, if we continue to provide too little help, our choice will be a communist Central America with additional communist military bases on the mainland of this hemisphere and communist subversion spreading southward and northward.
The president backed his words with money and manpower. Hundreds of CIA officers were hired. The company was back in business.
Went up and saw Casey, and Casey, said hello, and we talked, and we talked about the Central American thing. It was the issue of the day. And he said, look, take, as he did, he said, take off a couple of months, or take a couple of months and study this problem, and then come back to me with a recommendation on what we ought to do in Central America.
The number one target was Nicaragua. In 1979, the Sandinista revolution, backed by Castro and the Soviets, had toppled dictator Anastasio Somoza and brought a socialist government to Central America. Reagan convinced Congress to fund a very limited CIA operation to prevent the Sandinista revolution from spreading. Then he turned to his secret warriors.
Believe me, it didn't take rocket science, and it didn't take 2 months to figure out what ought to be done down there, okay? We should take the war to Nicaragua, and we should start killing Cubans. Because if you start making life difficult for the Cubans in Nicaragua, maybe they'll go home. Well, of course, this was exactly what Casey wanted to hear.
In 1981, only a small band of anti-Sandinista guerrillas existed. Then Dewey Claridge came in with weapons and money to create the force known as the Contras.
You got to understand, for Reagan, the Contras were his boys. I mean his boys. There's no way he was ever going to let them down.
As long as there is breath in this body, I will speak and work, strive and struggle for the cause of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters.
People got to understand this. People said, that Reagan was asleep at meetings, so on and so forth. I was in a lot of NSPG meetings, okay? And I never saw that man asleep. Now, maybe he was interested in the subject. Remember one time after an NSPG meeting, he said, "You think you can get your vandals to attack that airport down there when they bring the MiGs in. And I said, Mr. President, I don't think my vandals, who are your vandals, have quite got the wherewithal to get down into the planes and attack that airport.
With Reagan's unwavering support, the CIA operation grew beyond the mission Congress had originally approved. The Contras came out of the mountains to attack small towns and ports.
I'd gone in and shot up the port of Corinto to take out the crane, lit the whole town on fire by hitting all the oil tanks, but nothing was really happening in a real sense.
Casey wanted Claridge to pull off something big to destabilize the Sandinistas.
So I was sitting there and I was drinking some martinis. It was late in night. I know I was drinking gin on the rocks and smoking a cigar, of course. And, you know, it suddenly came to me that mines was the way to go.
Mining Nicaragua's harbors may have seemed like a good idea to Claridge and Casey, but when news reports uncovered the CIA's role, Americans began to question funding a war against civilians. To the public, Reagan's freedom fighters were looking more like terrorists. In 1984, Congress outlawed all aid to the Contras, and Dewey Claridge was reassigned. But Casey had other ideas.
The director was interested in the ability to go to an existing, as he put it, off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, stand-alone entity that could perform certain activities on behalf of the United States.
Casey recruited White House aide Oliver North to head up a secret enterprise outside the agency to sell arms to Iran and send the cash to the Contras. Both were illegal. Casey had put the CIA in the middle of another major scandal. Dewey Claridge was one of several CIA officers, subsequently indicted for lying to Congress to protect Reagan and Casey.
We were all pawns, many of us, in this fight between the executive and the Congress. In the course of all of this, the President of the United States and many others knew exactly what was going on.
In his 5 years on the job, Casey had revived the agency, but his Latin American operations left its reputation as tarnished as when he started.
In many respects, he was the best director that we had during my 30 years with CIA, and sadly will be in some ways the worst.
He was probably the leader of the agency that most loved it, or most loved my side of it. But all that said, I'd have to say he was a net loss.
A brain tumor killed William Casey before he was called to account for the worst CIA crisis in a decade, and before he could stake his claim to what may have been the CIA's greatest victory, the defeat of the Soviet army in Afghanistan. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the Cold War heated up. William Casey assigned two veteran CIA officers, Milt Bearden and Frank Anderson, to supply and train the outmatched Afghan guerrillas, known as the Mujahideen.
I, like everybody else, believed that ragtag bunches of third world insurgents don't defeat the Red Army.
The initial idea was only to bleed the bear, to make the Soviet war in Afghanistan as costly as possible. But William Casey wanted more.
I was in Pakistan. I saw Casey one time, and Casey said, "Why don't you go win it?" As opposed to, let's go and fight to the last Afghan, or let's just bleed the Soviets. No, he said, go win it.
Bearden and Anderson put together an exotic coalition of Polish, Egyptian, and Chinese arms dealers to equip the fiercely independent Afghan guerrillas.
I told them, look, guys, don't do car bombs. Don't do truck bombs. There's no percentages in it. Let's don't do that. So they would load a camel up with 150 pounds of Semtex plastic explosives
and tie it up against a building in this town in eastern Afghanistan, which is kind of like the USO and officers' canteen of the Soviet Army. And when they're all in there sitting around drinking their vodkas and watching whatever they're watching, rip that baby off and blow up 150 pounds of Semtex and a Camel and the Soviet Officers Club. And they were very proud to get back to me and said, "See, Mr. Milt, we did a Camel bomb. We didn't do a truck bomb."
What eventually brought down the Soviets was the U.S.-made Stinger missile. Inside the agency, they debated the future dangers of giving Islamic fundamentalists such a lethal weapon. But Casey's priority was beating the communists, and he prevailed.
A flight of Soviet attack helicopters was moving from Kabul down to this airfield. They stood up, ripped off the first Stinger of the great Afghan war, and it just flew like a great white dart across this blue sky and popped that first helicopter. Second gunner loaded up, and they stood there kind of like a buffalo stand for about another full minute and knocked out 3 of these guys. Pow, pow, pow.
The helicopter-killing Stinger turned the tide in the CIA's last battle of the Cold War. After suffering more than 13,000 combat deaths and a decade of severe economic strain, the Soviets abandoned the war against the Mujahideen. Bearden remembers the day when the last Soviet troops crossed the bridge to leave Afghanistan.
That night, I went home to Pakistan. You could see my office from the office of the KGB resident in Pakistan, and he had asked me on the circuit a number of times. He said, "Mr. Bearden, you must be working very hard all the time because I'm always seeing the light on in your office." And so I kept it on for 3 years just to kind of jerk this big potato-headed KGB general around. And then on the night of 15th February 1989, turned the light off.
The CIA's secret warriors had long dreamt of helping to defeat the Red Army. When Milt Bearden sent the news back to Langley, they broke out the champagne.
We're poor little lambs who have lost our way. Ba, ba, ba.
When the Cold War suddenly ended, the CIA lost its enemy in the great game.
After we settled into the Cold War, then it did become one big contest between the shirts and the skins. And we were the shirts and they were the skins. And your job was to show up for every match, wherever it was. That's the goal.
God, have mercy on such as we.
And then what happened really was that one day they didn't show up anymore.
The fall of the Iron Curtain had taken everyone by surprise, even the CIA. After 40 years on the front lines of the Cold War, America's secret warriors found out like everybody else, from television.
I'm sitting in my nice corner office in command of the Soviet East European Division and clicked on remote control, and there it was. That piece of the wall had been knocked over, and people were coming through. For me, it was a moment to rejoice beyond all, and I thought, can you believe that that's done?
For over 4 decades, the secret warriors did the dirty work for an American foreign policy based on the belief that the Soviets would never reform or change. At their moment of triumph, the CIA faced a cascade of criticism. They had failed to foresee the enemy's historic fall.
The appraisal of the relative strength or weakness of the Soviet Union has always been a political appraisal. It has never been an intelligence assessment, ever, ever, ever. It's only political.
The Cold War was a political struggle between 2 nuclear superpowers. The president made the key decisions, and his secret warriors decided how to carry out the orders. they saw their greatest challenge as subverting and containing communism without letting the Cold War escalate into a hot war.
We did get through this terrible period in which we threatened each other with 25,000 nuclear warheads on each side, and we didn't destroy the world. That's the greatest success. And intelligence played a major role in that.
Along the way, the CIA's secret warriors left their footprints on virtually every continent. They conducted major operations in at least 20 countries, as well as hundreds of smaller covert actions. Nations were devastated, and hundreds of thousands of people were tortured or killed in the proxy battles of the Cold War. At 50, the Brotherhood's days as a small, elite band of crusaders against communism are over. Weary from scandal, contempt of the public, the agency has settled into a vast bureaucracy, its mission unclear, and its future uncertain.